My mother forged my father's signature to sell the house I grew up in, so her boyfriend could open a restaurant with the money. And when I stood up at that restaurant's grand opening with a lawyer, a lawsuit letter, and my own father standing right behind me, my mother's face went white as a ghost. She looked at me like I was the villain. I looked at her and said one thing: "You didn't lose the house, Mom. You gave it away to a man who was never going to keep you." 6 months later, that man was gone, and so was every dollar she had left. This is the story of how my mother chose a stranger over her own family, and what it cost her to find out too late that she was wrong. My name is Amanda. I'm 32 years old, and until last year, I thought my family was solid. Not perfect, but solid. My parents, Denise and Robert, were married for 29 years before they split up. It wasn't ugly at first. They just grew apart, the way people do. My dad moved into a small apartment across town, and my mom stayed in the house on Maple Court, the house I grew up in. The house where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, and where my brother Mark and I used to sneak downstairs on Christmas mornings before anyone else woke up. That house wasn't just property, it was the one constant in my life. After the divorce, my mom kept the house, and I helped her with the mortgage payments for almost 3 years because her job alone couldn't cover it. I didn't mind. She was my mother. Mark lived 2 states away with his own family, so it was mostly me who showed up, who fixed things, who sat with her on the porch when she cried about getting older alone. Then, about a year and a half ago, she started seeing someone. His name was Gary. He was 45, charming in that too smooth way, always talking about his big plans, his restaurant concept, his connections. At first I thought, fine, she deserves happiness. I had no idea how much that happiness was going to cost all of us. The first sign something was wrong was small. My mom mentioned, almost casually over dinner, that Gary needed a little help getting his restaurant off the ground, and she'd offered to co-sign a business loan for him. I remember blinking and asking her to repeat that. She waved it off like it was nothing, said Gary had it handled. Said he just needed her name on the paperwork because his credit was, in her words, still recovering from his last divorce. I didn't love it, but it wasn't my money and it wasn't my name on the line, so I let it go. A few weeks later, she brought up selling some of her jewelry, stuff my grandmother left her, to help Gary cover a supplier deposit. I pushed back a little that time. I asked her why a grown man with all these big restaurant plans needed her jewelry and her credit and her savings just to get started. She got defensive, said I didn't understand what it was like to build something with someone, said I was young and didn't know how relationships worked. I dropped it because I didn't want to fight with her. But something in my stomach didn't sit right. The way it doesn't sit right when you see a crack in the ceiling and tell yourself it's probably nothing. Gary started coming around more. He was always polite to my face, complimenting me, asking about my job, but there was something performative about it, like he was reading from a script of how a nice guy behaves. My dad, when I mentioned Gary to him, just went quiet and said, "Be careful, Amanda. Your mother's lonely, and lonely people make expensive mistakes." I told him he was overreacting. I was wrong. 3 months after the jewelry conversation, my mom called me crying, saying Gary's restaurant deal had hit a snag, that the location he wanted was about to fall through because he needed a huge lump sum for the lease and build-out, more than either of them had. I told her flatly, "There is no way I'm giving you money for this, Mom, and there's no way you should either." She said she understood, said she'd never ask that of me, and thanked me for listening. I felt relieved. I thought the conversation had actually landed. What I didn't know was that she'd already made a decision, and she wasn't telling me because she knew what I'd say. A few weeks later, I drove by the house to drop off some mail that still came to her address, and there was a moving truck in the driveway. Not a small truck. A full moving truck, with 2 guys carrying boxes out of the living room. I remember standing on the sidewalk, feeling like the ground had actually tilted under me. I called her, and she picked up sounding strange, too calm. The calm of someone who's been rehearsing what they're going to say. She told me she'd sold the house, just like that. Sold the house I grew up in, the house my dad still had partial ownership of on paper, because of unresolved details from the divorce settlement, The house that represented every memory I had of being a whole family. I asked her how, since Dad's name was still on some of the documents. She got quiet, too quiet. And then she said something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Your father doesn't need to know everything, Amanda. I asked her what that meant. She wouldn't answer. She just said Gary had handled the paperwork, and that everything was legal, everything was fine, and that this was her chance to finally build something for herself. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in front of the house I no longer owned any piece of, and I cried harder than I had in years. Not because of the house itself, but because I understood, in that moment, that my mother had chosen a man she'd known for a year and a half over her own children, her own history, and possibly my father's legal rights. And she hadn't even had the decency to tell any of us to our faces. I called my dad immediately, shaking, and told him what happened. There was a long silence on the phone, and then he said 4 words that changed everything. Amanda, I never signed anything. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. If he never signed off on the sale, and the sale went through anyway, that meant someone had forged his signature on the transfer documents. I asked him to check his old paperwork, anything with his signature on it, so we could compare. Within 2 days, my dad had pulled his divorce settlement copies and noticed something chilling. His signature on the new deed transfer didn't match his real one, not even close. Sloppy in a way his real signature never was. My dad, calm as he's always been, didn't scream or threaten anyone. He just quietly said, "Then we're going to need a lawyer." We hired one immediately, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specializes in property fraud and family disputes. She reviewed the documents and told us within the first meeting that this wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was forgery. This was fraud. And depending on how the money moved afterward, it could also be financial exploitation, especially if Gary had directed or pressured my mother into it. I confronted my mom on the phone, told her what the lawyer found, told her dad never signed those papers. She started crying, said she didn't know exactly what Gary had done with the documents, that he'd told her it was just a formality, and that she trusted him completely. I asked her the question that had been eating at me. Did you know this was fraud when you let it happen? She didn't answer directly. She just kept saying, I trusted him. I trusted him. Like repeating it enough times would make it true. Meanwhile, Gary had already used a huge chunk of the house sale proceeds as a down payment on commercial restaurant space downtown, with grand opening plans already being advertised online. My mother had moved in with him into a rental near the new restaurant, cutting off contact with me and Mark almost completely, saying we were too negative and didn't support her happiness. My father, for the first time since the divorce, sat across from me at a diner and said quietly, I'm not doing this to hurt her, Amanda. I'm doing this because if we don't stop this now, she's going to lose everything, and so are we. That was the moment the whole family stopped absorbing the hits quietly and started building a plan. Sarah, our lawyer, moved fast once we had the forgery confirmed by a handwriting analyst. She drafted a formal cease and desist, along with a civil lawsuit against both my mother and Gary for fraud and forged conveyance, seeking to void the sale and recover damages. But we made a strategic choice. Instead of filing quietly and waiting months for a court date while Gary drained every last cent of that money into his restaurant, we decided to deliver the lawsuit letter in person, at the one place Gary couldn't fake his way out of, his own grand opening. My dad wanted answers. Mark flew in the second he heard about the forged signature. I wanted my mother to understand, in front of everyone, exactly what kind of man she'd given everything up for. The restaurant's grand opening was set for a Saturday evening. Invitations sent to local business owners, a food blogger, even a small local news reporter Gary had personally invited to boost buzz for his big debut. We showed up right as the ribbon-cutting photos were being taken, my father in a plain gray suit, Sarah Chen beside him with a folder in her hand, and me standing just behind them. The room went quiet in that strange, ripple-through-the-crowd way when people sense something is about to happen. My mother saw us first, and her champagne glass actually trembled in her hand. The room was full of investors, Gary's business partners, a couple of local reporters with cameras half raised, and my mother standing beside Gary in a dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. My father stepped forward first, calm, steady, and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I'd like to know when I supposedly signed away my rights to a house I've never agreed to sell." Gary tried to laugh it off, said something about a misunderstanding, but Sarah Chen stepped forward and held up the folder. "This is a certified forensic handwriting analysis," she said, confirming that the signature on the deed transfer for the Maple Court property does not match Robert's known signature in any of 6 independent samples. The room went dead silent. A reporter's camera clicked. My mother's face drained of color as she looked between Gary and my father, realizing in real time that this wasn't a private family argument anymore. It was public, documented, and legal. I stepped forward and looked directly at my mother. "You didn't lose the house, Mom. You gave it away to a man who was never going to keep you." Gary tried to interject, tried to spin it as some kind of paperwork mix-up his assistant handled, but Sarah calmly informed him, in front of everyone, that the lawsuit named him specifically as a co-defendant in the fraud, and that local police had already been notified given the forged legal document. Someone in the crowd actually gasped out loud. A woman near the back, who I later learned was one of Gary's investors, muttered, "This is exactly what happened to his last wife." My mother turned to Gary, desperate, asking him what that woman meant, and Gary, for the first time all night, had absolutely nothing smooth to say. In the weeks after that night, everything Gary built collapsed fast. The lawsuit became public record. Local news picked up the story about the forged deed, and 2 more people came forward claiming Gary had used similar manipulation tactics with them in past business deals, including his ex-wife, who had lost her savings in almost the exact same way years earlier. Investors pulled out overnight. The restaurant, drowning in debt from its overpriced build-out, closed within 3 months of that grand opening, the doors locked, the sign still fresh with paint. And Gary, true to the pattern everyone had warned about, disappeared the moment my mother had nothing left to offer him financially. He didn't even leave a note. He just stopped answering her calls one week and was gone the next, taking what little remained with him. My mother, who once told me I didn't understand real love, was left alone in a rental apartment with no house, no restaurant, no partner, and a lawsuit still very much active against her for her role in the forged sale. It was my father, the man she'd left behind years earlier, who ended up being the one who kept his composure through all of it, who worked with Sarah to structure a settlement that would let my mom avoid criminal charges by cooperating fully and returning what funds could still be recovered. When she finally called me, crying, saying she didn't know what she was thinking, saying she was sorry, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I told her I loved her. But that trust wasn't something that just snaps back into place because someone finally sees clearly what everyone else saw months ago. She's living with me temporarily now while she rebuilds, slowly. And some days it feels like healing, and other days it feels like walking on ice that hasn't fully frozen yet. My dad and I are closer than we've been in years, strange as that sounds, forged in a courtroom instead of a kitchen table. So here's my question for you. If your parents chose a stranger over your entire family and lost everything doing it, would you let them come back home? Or would some trust just be gone for good? Let me know what you'd do in the comments. And if this story kept you hooked, hit like, share it with someone who needs a wild family drama today, and come back tomorrow, because the next story might be even harder to believe.